Hi folks, Steve here, and this is a video about how I painted this Nighthaunt Briar Queen, so let's crack on. I put this model together in the previous video that I did about how I add texture to models, so you can go check that out if you're interested in how I did that. I'm going to start off by giving the model a zenithal prime, so the first thing I'm doing is hitting it with black through the airbrush. Now you can see that the model's grey at the moment, and that's because I already gave it a hit with primer from a spray can. Grey was the only colour that I happened to have at the time. Next I'm coming in with some white paint. The paint is really diluted, so it's just going on really thin so it appears grey at first, and this just allows me to build it up in a few layers. And once I'm happy with that is when we'll start getting some colour in. I'm still sticking with the airbrush. This time I've got quite a dark green. This is again my darkest green and my darkest blue mixed together, almost equal ratio. And I want this to really hit the underside of the model and get into all the shadows, all the deep recesses, things like that. And this is still quite dilute as well, so it's going to work with the black that's in there, and it's also going to work with the greys and the whites from the zenithal. After that I'm using a combination of colours. This is Necrotic Flesh, Desert Yellow and Skeleton Bone from Army Painter. Remember, it's not the brand of the paint or the colour that matters, it's what paints you have. A mix of that I'm using to spray down over the model, and this is to start building some highlights on there. You'll see I'm building this up quite gradually, step by step. I'm just working around the model, pretty similar to what I did at the stage of the zenithal prime, where you're using the white and you're just wanting to build up that focus gradually higher up the model. Then I'm going in with a much lighter mix, which is basically pure white but with a little bit of the bone colour mixed in, and this is for getting the call it a headdress, this shroud that she's wearing at the top, and just to really boost that and make it very, very bright, because I want that to look like a dirty white colour when we finish painting. Now I'm going to use a blue that I've made from using the blue I originally used for my shadow colour, so it was a deep blue from Army Painter mixed with Mutation Green from Vallejo. There's a bit of white in with that blue as well, and this is going to focus on the shroud or the robes that are underneath the armour on the lower part of the body. I'm just doing this bit by bit, taking my time, spray here, spray there. The pressure's quite low. With an airbrush it's that quick to get the colour on that you can really take your time and be careful about it anyway, so I really like doing that. Once I'm happy with that, we're done with the airbrush and it's time to move on to a regular brush and get the details done. The first step is going to be a very light, quick dry brush over the areas that we've just painted blue, and for that I'm using a 50-50 mix of Skeleton Bone and Necrotic Flesh. Necrotic Flesh is it's kind of a flesh tone almost, but it's more green, it's very, very light. And this dry brush is just going to help us pick out the details a little bit, so they'll stand out a bit more at the later stages when we get the oil wash on it. Working on the arms, I'm going to use the same three paints that I used in the airbrush earlier to get the highlights down. So that's the Necrotic Flesh, the Skeleton Bone and Desert Yellow. I've got a bit of a mix of them going on my palette. It's very dilute, and I'm going to go in and start slowly working on that, pretty much like glazes. The airbrush has already done most of the heavy lifting, so we've got shadows, we've got highlights mapped out, things like that. I'm basically just going to push where I think the highlights need to be higher. I'm going to glaze in some colours, so I might increase the yellow in a few areas just to make the skin seem a bit more sickly. I'm just going to go around adding a bit of texture, so using a bit of a stippling technique. So whenever I'm painting skin, flesh, that kind of thing, I like to use a mixture of little dots and dabs on my brush, as well as just sort of glazing the colours on as well to push the highlight and the shine of the skin here and there. This step is really about going back and forth to taste. I might bring a highlight up and then decide I actually want to take it down a little bit, so I'll go back in with a slightly darker colour or maybe a bit more of the yellow. Because you're working with really thin paints, it's getting that transparent layer on top, and it does create this kind of textured look which looks really good close up. It's a great technique for skin, so really the more back and forth you go, the better I think it looks when you have your final result. And it's just fun to play around, I think, anyway. Again, here on the back of the arm you can see where I'm using a mixture of brush strokes, so you've got the stippling, the little dabs of paint, and then at certain points I'll also just draw my brush along, almost like doing an edge highlight, which you kind of are in a way, so you can mix up these brush strokes just to get a really interesting and varied effect on the model. So don't be afraid of thinking, oh well, you know, I can't do an edge highlight on skin, because it's not really an edge highlight, but you're using the same technique to get a different effect. For the face, or the skull rather, I'm going to use a mix that focuses a little bit more on the skeleton bone to get that bone colour into it. Then I'm also going to take a really dark brown, so this is Army Painter Oak Brown, which is very transparent again, and I'm going to thin that right down to a glaze and get that and just glaze it into the shadows, to the recesses there, to really darken it. And then I'll go back to the skeleton bone and maybe lighten it up just a little bit, and then use that to get the highlights in on the face there, to catch the edges around the eye sockets, jawline, things like that. Now it's time to base coat the metallics. For this I used a paint that I'd mixed up from a gunmetal silver colour, Army Painter Weapon Bronze, and a little bit of the oak brown that I still had on my palette as well, and I'm just going to get all the metallic items painted with that. I'm now going to take an off-white colour called Mummy Robes, and I'm going to use this, again pretty diluted, and I'm going to start working on the highlights on the edges of this shroud that she's wearing. The idea is here I'm going to focus on the upper parts of the model, so the shroud is kind of framing the face and the shoulders, and that's really what you want people to focus on when they see the model. So I'm going to make sure that I've got some nice highlights going on there. I'm going to make the edges nice and bright, things like that. So I'm just going to work around back and forth, again deciding where I want to emphasise these lines and ridges, and just get the colour out on this just so it stands out. I'm now going to give all the metallic parts a green wash. For this I'm using Army Painter's green tone, but you could use whatever you had if you've got the Games Workshop one. I think it's Athonian Camel Shade, something like that. Any green wash or even very diluted green paint will work for this. And because I still have the off-white colour on my palette as well, I can just touch up any areas that I want to increase the volume on there, and if there's anywhere where the green wash has spilt over onto the white as well, it's very easy to go back and correct that. To paint the roses, I just take a red, any red doesn't matter, mix in a little bit of the off-white that I was using to create a pink colour, and we'll just go with that. The leaves on the vine get a quick glaze of dark green as well. Next up, working on the armour, I use some Nighthaunt Oxide from Games Workshop. It's quite watered down as well, I don't use it straight from the pot, and I'm just going to work this into the armoured parts. With it being diluted, it helps to make the metal look aged and weathered, but it doesn't take away that overall metallic look, the shine of it. For the rust on this occasion, I decided to use a liquid pigment from Greenstuff World. This is light rust. There are many other ways of doing rust. In the past I've just used orange acrylic paint as well, so you can really use whatever your favourite way of painting rust is. This was just something new that I bought and I decided that I was going to use it. I like to play around with using the patina of the Nighthaunt Oxide or something similar, and then the orange of whatever rust I'm painting with, almost like shadows and highlights. So I'll pick one that I want to use where I would use a shadow colour, and one that I would use as a highlight. In this case I'm using the rust a little bit more like a highlight, but you can reverse it around as well, so you can have the sort of patina colour as a highlight and then the rust as this shadow, which actually works quite well, having a sort of bright shadow effect. It's quite nice. I also got the base out of the way. This was painted mostly using Darkstone from Army Painter. We've now hit the oil wash stage, so this first wash is just a blue oil paint. There's a tiny little black in it because I used the same brush that I'd used to mix up the black paint, so I didn't mind that because I wanted it a little bit darker anyway, and that's just getting a wash all over the area we'd originally got the blue on with the brush back at the beginning of the video. Next up is the burnt umber oil wash. I like to actually normally start with the lightest colours and work towards the darkest when I'm doing multiple oil washes. Might not be any easier, but it's just my personal preference. For the burnt umber, this is going to paint everything that's bone, that's skin, things like that. And it will also go on the branches, the vines that are coming out of the arms of the model as well. Or the arm, I should say, it's only coming out of the one. After this, the black wash goes on everything else, so the shroud, the base as well. I do go on quite heavy with the oil washes, and that's because As it's drying, I tend to go in with a brush that's damp with mineral spirit and just remove any excess away. And I also do this again once it's dry, just to make sure that I'm happy overall with the placement of the wash. And at this stage, once the oil wash is dry, I'm going to go in and highlight the metallics. For that, I'm going to use a colour that's made from the original metallic colour that I mixed, the combination of chainmail, weapon bronze and a little bit of brown, and I brightened this up using an army painter colour which I cannot remember the name of. I think it might be silver plate mail, something like that, much brighter than the chainmail, but just to tone it up a bit. The goal here is to just work around the model, picking out any of those metallic areas that I think need a little bit of a highlight, put a bit of a shine into them, and just make them pop a little bit on the model and give it a little bit of a point of difference from the sort of mute matte tones that we've got going on. Then we highlight the petals of the roses using the original pink to pick out the upper areas and the edges. Can also add a little bit more of the off-white colour in as well, and go across the very tips of the petals just to really give them a bit of a boost. To paint the thorns, I use a technical paint called Glistening Blood. I've mixed a little bit of red ink in, paint the entire thorn, and then as it dries, paint the tip again just to sort of boost the gore effect on it. I'm now going back to our off-white colour, mummy robes, and I'm just boosting the highlights again on the shroud, on those white areas, because we knocked them back before using the black oil wash, and so I'm just going to pick out all the edges and the folds, things like that I really want to give a boost to the colour there. Then you know what time it is. It's time to paint the rim of the base black. I love this bit. And we are calling this Briar Queen done. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss out on any other videos. And that's all for now, so thanks very much. Take care, bye.